There is a particular kind of failure that history has never learned to categorize cleanly. Not the failure of the villain, not the failure of the fool, not the failure of the coward or the corrupt or the casually indifferent man who never troubled himself to ask whether what he was doing was right. The failure of the man who knew it was right, who had the record and the convictions and the institutional courage to prove he believed it, who had spent his life building the evidence of his own decency into structures that outlasted the building. Schools, hospitals, universities, the tangible architecture of a man who did not merely hold his beliefs but acted them into existence at personal cost. That failure is the quietest of all, and the most complete, because it arrives with no villain to assign the blame to and no ignorance to cite in mitigation and nothing at all to place between the man and the full weight of what his goodness was not sufficient to prevent. General Oliver Otis Howard spent 4 months in the summer and autumn of 1877 riding into the center of that failure. He rode across 1,170 miles of the most punishing terrain the American interior contains. He rode through 11 engagements against an adversary he had personally attempted to protect. He rode with one arm. The right one had been surgically removed at Fair Oaks, Virginia in June of 1862, which meant that every cold morning in the saddle, every dispatch back to his superiors explaining why the people he was chasing were still not caught, every mile of a pursuit that was becoming, with each successive week, less a military campaign and more a public accounting of everything he had believed about himself and his government and the promises both of them had made. All of it was accomplished by a man whose body already carried the permanent evidence of what service to his country had previously extracted from him. He had already given his right arm. Now the frontier was coming for something harder to replace. West Point, class of 1854. 4th in his class. He entered the army the way men enter things they were made for, completely without reservation, with the particular confidence of someone whose abilities and whose calling have arrived at the same address simultaneously. The Civil War found him ready. Fair Oaks, May of 1862. 2 wounds in the right arm in a single engagement, the arm amputated, Howard back in command within months. Not because the Army required it of him, because he required it of himself. At Chancellorsville, his corps was shattered by Stonewall Jackson's flanking assault. One of the war's most complete tactical surprises, a defeat that attached itself to Howard's military reputation, with the stubborn permanence that defeats attach themselves to the reputations of the men who survived them. He carried it forward. He fought at Gettysburg. He marched with Sherman to the sea. He accumulated the record of a man who understood that the only available response to a bad entry in the ledger was to keep writing until the ledger told a different story. After the war, his government gave him the assignment that communicated more clearly than any battle command what his superiors understood him to be. They gave him the Freedmen's Bureau, 4 million people released from bondage into a freedom that the society surrounding them was specifically organized to deny. The most morally serious administrative responsibility the post-war government had available to assign, given to the officer whose religious convictions and genuine belief in human dignity made him, in the government's assessment, the man most likely to approach it as something other than a bureaucratic inconvenience. He established schools. He built hospitals. He negotiated on behalf of people whose only other negotiator was the silence of a government that had freed them and then largely lost interest in what freedom required to function. He founded the university in Washington that carries his name to this day, built specifically, deliberately as an act of institutional conscience, to provide what the surrounding civilization was institutionally organized to prevent. Oliver Howard was not a man who held his convictions as abstractions. He held them as obligations. He had spent the years between Appomattox and his Western posting making that distinction visible in brick and mortar and legislation, and the accumulated record of a man who understood that believing the right thing and doing nothing about it were morally indistinguishable from not believing it at all. When the Army sent him to the Department of the Columbia in 1874, he brought every conviction he had earned and every lesson the Freedmen's Bureau had taught him, and he applied them to the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest with the same sincerity he had brought to everything that had preceded it. He met the Nez Perce. He negotiated. He believed, with the full weight of a man whose record of acting on his beliefs was documented and genuine, that the government he represented intended to honor the agreements being reached. He was wrong, and the 1,170 miles that followed were the specific shape that wrongness took when it arrived to collect what he owed it. June 17, 1877, Whitebird Canyon, Idaho Territory. Howard had sent Captain David Perry forward with 99 cavalry soldiers to locate the non-treaty Nez Perce bands and move them toward compliance. Approximately 70 Nez Perce warriors met that force in the canyon and drove it from the field with a completeness that the official report subsequently labored to describe in language compatible with continued military careers. 34 soldiers died. The survivors retreated in a condition that the ground evidence documented more honestly than the dispatches did. The Nez Perce suffered no combat fatalities. The first engagement of the war Howard was commanding had produced one of the most one-sided defeats the United States Army had suffered in the entire history of the Indian Wars. And the people who had just delivered that defeat were already moving, with their families, their horses, their elderly, their children, their wounded, toward a destination that Howard was now formally, officially, and very publicly obligated to prevent them from reaching. He pursued across the Bitterroot Mountains through the Lolo Pass, terrain so technically demanding that Howard's column fell further behind with each successive day of movement, the gap between the pursuing force and the pursued widening in a way that the dispatches back to his superiors described with the careful language of men who understood that the dispatches were being read by people who expected results and were not receiving them. He pursued across the Bitterroot Valley where the local civilian population received the passing Nez Perce with a cordiality that the passing army did not receive, which was itself a commentary on the preceding months of pressure and broken promise that no military report acknowledged directly. He pursued across the Yellowstone Plateau through the national park that the nation had established 5 years earlier as a place of contemplation and wonder, and that the Nez Perce crossed in late August while civilian tourists who had traveled considerable distances to observe geysers found themselves instead observing a military campaign of continental consequence passing through their vacation at a speed that left no time for introductions. He pursued across the Missouri River country as the summer became autumn and the nights became serious, and the distance to the Canadian border, the border beyond which Sitting Bull and his people were already living beyond the Army's reach, shrank from something abstract to something measurable in days of hard riding. Through all of it, the Nez Perce remained ahead of him. Not barely ahead, not by the slim margin of a desperate people running on reserves of endurance that would eventually give out. Ahead with a consistency and a tactical sophistication that communicated something the official reports continued to decline to state plainly: that the force Howard was pursuing was being directed by military minds of the first order. Minds that read terrain and managed logistics and made decisions under pressure with a capability that the Army's own officer corps could not have reliably matched under the same conditions. Howard was a soldier of genuine distinction. He had proven it across 4 years of the most demanding military conflict the continent had produced, and he was being outmaneuvered, consistently. Across 4 months and 11 engagements and 1,170 miles of American interior by people whose territory was being taken from them and who had decided with a clarity that military desperation sometimes produces that they were not going to surrender the taking without making the takers work for every single mile. His dispatches during those 4 months are documents worth reading with the full attention they require. They are the dispatches of a man managing, with the formal discipline that his rank demanded, the growing distance between what he had believed at the campaign's opening and what the campaign was demonstrating with each successive week. They do not collapse into self-pity. They do not revise the official position or acknowledge publicly the private reckoning that the miles and the engagements and the consistently insufficient results were forcing upon him. They maintain the professional register of an officer reporting to superiors who required progress and were not receiving it at the rate they required it. But beneath that register, in the specific choices of language, in the quality of admiration that occasionally surfaces in his descriptions of Nez Perce tactical decisions, in the particular precision with which he documents what was done to him in his column and why it was effective, is the portrait of a man conducting a sustained internal examination of the gap between what he had told the Nez Perce about the reliability of the government he represented and what the government he represented was in the process of demonstrating about its reliability. He had told them the promises would be honored. He had believed it when he said it. The 4 months that followed were the demonstration of what believing something sincerely and being correct about it are two entirely different conditions, and that a man of genuine conviction can be sincerely, completely, and consequentially wrong. Colonel Nelson Miles ended it. A forced march from Fort Keogh cut the Nez Perce off at the Bear Paw Mountains on September 30th, 1877. 40 miles from the Canadian border, 40 miles from Sitting Bull, 40 miles from the conclusion that 1,130 miles of extraordinary movement had been building toward. 5 days of engagement. Chief Joseph's surrender on October 5th. Howard arrived in time to witness the surrender that Miles had received. He arrived as a general who had pursued 1,170 miles and been present for the final 40. The specific geometry of that arrival, the man who had commanded the pursuit present for its conclusion as an observer rather than its author, required no narration to communicate its meaning to anyone who had been following the preceding 4 months. He lived until 1909. He wrote memoirs. He continued the public Christian life that had defined him since before the war found him at Fair Oaks. He wrote about the Nez Perce with the measured admiration of a man who had spent enough time trying to catch them to understand precisely what he had been trying to catch. Their military sophistication, the quality of their leadership, the discipline of people moving across impossible terrain under impossible pressure, with a coherence that armies with full resources and institutional support struggle to maintain. He expressed the belief that they had been wronged. The record suggests he meant it, what the formal structures of memoir and public address did not provide adequate space for, what the required register of a general officer reviewing a completed campaign cannot fully contain, is the specific interior weight of 4 months spent riding toward a reckoning that no amount of military achievement could have resolved in his favor. The Freedmen's Bureau, Howard University. The negotiations conducted in what he understood and what the record suggests genuinely was good faith. The entire architecture of a life constructed on the proposition that a man could serve his government and serve justice without the two obligations eventually pointing in different directions. The Nez Perce War was the moment that proposition was tested across 1,170 miles of American interior, and the test, conducted in the specific currency of terrain and engagement, and the consistent documented undeniable failure to catch people who had every reason to be caught and declined to be. That test returned a verdict that Oliver Howard's convictions had not prepared him to receive, and that his record of genuine decency could not commute into something more comfortable. He was a good man, in the service of a policy that goodness alone could not redeem. The frontier produced that combination with a regularity that its history has never fully resolved. Oliver Howard was its most complete expression. a man of documented virtue, genuine failure, and the particular devastation of someone who looked at what his country was doing and believed, with everything his life had given him reason to believe, that he was on the right side of it. He was on the right side of the man he had made himself. He was on the wrong side of everything else. And the 1,170 miles between those two positions is the most honest distance the American frontier ever produced.